and perhaps I stand in Dundee tonight, I have a fond hope that the founding fathers of this distinguished university deliberately gave it its motto, which in Latin reads, Magnificat anima mea Domino. My soul does magnify the Lord. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Now it's your turn. And we're going to do something to which you may not be used, because in a large audience like this, it's fascinating to me to find out what kind of questions are buzzing around in your mind. Now is the time for questions, not for many lectures or lengthy statements. We haven't got a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to have a couple of microphones running around, and I'm going to collect a number of questions before I look at any of them, so we get some idea of what various people are thinking. So if you've got a question, put up your hand, the microphone will see you, and make it as clear and short as possible. I will write it down, and then when I think we've got enough questions, I will try to answer them. So,
Richard Carr, I would like to ask the question whether Hawkins has considered the philosophical question or statement that man can ask the question whether God exists, but that man can't answer it.
Okay, that's number one, thank you. Number two?
You've posed in a very didactic manner two alternatives, theism or atheism. I would prefer agnosticism, saying that we really don't know and cannot know what lies behind, and that this gives us a sense of the utter wonder and extraordinariness of the world without committing us to views which I would agree with you that atheism is absurd, but I also think theism, to me anyway, is deeply unsatisfactory. Why can't we just be content not to know and to meditate on the beauty of things such as it is?
Thank you very much. Next.
In a similar vein, I worry that you're materialist and theist distinction. I wonder if you've considered instead that really, as in the history of philosophy up until this point, until you gave this lecture, the distinction was really materialist, idealist, and that to introduce a materialist theist dichotomy is a wrong thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Next. You can see, by the way, if I go on doing this for long enough, I won't have to answer any of them.
Mine was more just a simple statement. Why should the God debate actually matter to science? If you believe in God, that's a subjective thing. Science should carry on answering the questions as best it can, because if God comes into it, there's always a get-out clause, and you think that perhaps the God debate shouldn't matter to science that much.
Thank you. This is getting really interesting. Yeah, 5. I'm going to have to call out a halt in a minute.
On the theory of relativity, beg your pardon, on the Big Bang theory, the theory of the Big Bang theory, what went bang?
What went bang? You know, when you give a lecture in Russia, ladies and gentlemen, they have a marvelous way of controlling you. When you're talking, they come up with written pages and they put them in front of you and bow. And the longer you go on, the greater. Right, we'll have to stop now and have a look at some of these. Has Hawking considered the philosophical question, man can ask whether God exists but can't answer it? Well, I'm sorry, but I cannot know whether he's asked that question or not. I don't, from my recollection, seem to have read anything like that. It relates to one of the later questions, actually, as to what we can know and what we cannot know. And I'm going to link the two. The questioner raised the issue of theism or atheism. Why didn't I mention agnosticism? I could also have mentioned several other things, actually, sir. The limitations of time meant that I confined myself to what I see as the major polarization. But as you say, you don't seem to be very convinced by atheism. You think it's absurd. You think theism has problems. That means that you have reflected on both of them. And you've come to a conclusion. So the agnosticism is an attitude to those two worldviews. If you like, you can include agnosticism in the worldviews, because although most of us would admit that we are agnostic about many things. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because I would not like you to go away with the impression that I am claiming some sort of universal knowledge. I think it is very important that we think like Newton did, and certainly I feel like it, that when he looked at the great amount of things lying out there, he said, I feel like a child playing on the sand with a few pebbles when an ocean of undiscovered truth lies before me. The interesting thing about that quotation is he believed there was truth out there to be perceived. And that, of course, even in a so-called postmodern age, is still a fundamental conviction of science. There is something out there to be grasped. Now, therefore, there are many things we don't know, but you went a step further, and you said there are things we cannot know. But that raises a little question of how you know we cannot know. And it seems to me that it reflects on something I hinted at in the lecture, which I hold for very important. And that is, as we think of epistemology and are getting to know things, when it comes to what I've been talking about, that is this: what can we read off the physical universe? It is very interesting that even within the Christian tradition, the Apostle Paul makes it very clear that what you can deduce from the physical universe is limited. In his famous statement, he says, from the beginning of creation, there are certain things we can perceive, not prove. You only get proof in mathematics, but can perceive in the things that are made, namely that there is a God, theotokos in Greek, which I take to mean that there is a God, and that he is powerful. In other words, what we might call the natural revelation is limited. You have to bring other evidence to bear. Now, in this matter of what we can know and what we cannot know, we have to then raise inevitably the question, is there any aid to the human faculty of reason? Now, the point I made very briefly, and I would now illuminate it once more, is that my human reason can work on the natural world as it can work on Aunt Matilda's cake. I cannot know why she made the cake unless she reveals it. But if she reveals it to me, I would be rather absurd to suggest I cannot know it because my scientific investigation have not given me the answer to it. Now that raises the very big question, which is not the topic of my lecture tonight except obliquely, as to whether there is a being who stands in the same relation to our universe as Aunt Matilda to the cake, and whether or not he has spoken. I believe he has. You see. So I would want to take in revelation that there are things that unaided reason cannot know, but they are revealed, and reason then works on them to understand what they're saying. It doesn't shut reason out. But what I take from what you say, and it's a very good corrective, and I am grateful to you for it, that it is very important that we never lose a sense of wonder. I do wish some of our kids had more of a sense of wonder at this universe, and anything we can do to increase that sense of wonder through science and art and so on is well worth doing. Now, a philosopher among us has asked, why did I not split between materialist and idealist? For the simple reason that if I was going to talk about idealism, I would want to contrast that not with materialism, but realism. which really stands at the opposite end of the perspective of that. And all I was wanting to say is that it seems to me, at the simplest initial level, that these two kinds of explanations of the universe, that is, that matter is all that exists, or that it is not all that exists, that there is a cause of it who is God. That's a rough and ready distinction. Now, what I should have said, and perhaps you would have been happier with this, was that there are not simply a couple of worldviews, there are a couple of families of worldviews. And there are subtle and important distinctions to be made between them. But since this wasn't a lecture on philosophy, I thought that saying simply what I did would be enough. Now, the Big Bang. What went bang? I haven't a notion what went bang. Remember, Fred Hoyle, he conjured up the word Big Bang as a joke. He didn't like the idea of a beginning to the universe at all. He held the view of the steady state. And so he was really mocking when he said a Big Bang. But I think it's very important that we realize that Big Bang is a label and a mystery. What it's saying from the perspective of the standard model of the universe is that there was a beginning to space-time. Now that's the thing I find fascinating about it, because I'm old, ladies and gentlemen. I actually was alive in the 1960s, and some of you weren't. And I remember when the evidence started coming in for the hot Big Bang origin of the universe, and the way in which it was opposed by leading scientists, such as the editor of Nature, John Maddox, who says we must not give in to this notion of the Big Bang. Why? Because it will give too much leverage to people who believe in creation. And that was a very interesting thing to discover, a scientific advance being resisted because it fitted in with a biblical paradigm. So what I take from that, and Richard Dawkins and I had a bit of a spat on it, and I said, you know, the Bible got this right. It's been saying for centuries there was a beginning. Well, he said, what's in that? I mean, there's a 50% chance. But I said, I didn't think scientists worked on the basis that there's a 50% chance. The question of introducing a singularity where space-time began was an immense effort that produced several Nobel Prizes, including Penzias and so on. So it's not as simple as that. And I simply made the point for people who think the Bible has nothing to say about the material universe. Remember, the Bible is not a textbook of science. But the things it says about the universe, though few in number, are highly significant. And one of them is the way it starts. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is fascinating. How did they know it when it took them to 1960 to get a grasp of it? So then, so much for the Big Bang. A couple more questions and I will stop. Have I got a moment or two more? I have a few moments. This lady, you know, she's charming. But she is powerful. But anyway, why should the God debate matter to science? I like that question. I've been thinking about it since you asked it. Why should the God debate matter to science? Well, apparently it matters. You came here this evening. But it's a very important question, because if we're not careful, we can get a very distorted impression for this evening. For the vast majority of science that's done in your university here and elsewhere, the God question is, strictly speaking, irrelevant. If you are working on some biological organism and working out how it works, what are the enzymes, what are the biochemical pathways, you're not thinking at all about God, and quite rightly so. The place where the overlap comes is where you are thinking often about origins and existence and what science can point to. Now, one of the things I have been saying tonight, but I haven't crystallized it, is this. For me, one of the major arguments from a scientific perspective that there is a God is not the results of science, it's the fact we can do science.